They left him for dead beneath the burning Texas sun. A lawman turned ghost of the plains, his blood soaking into dust no one would ever see. The vultures circled. The wind whispered his last rites. But just beyond that empty horizon, a small figure moved, barefoot, trembling, clutching a tattered doll. A little girl who should have run the other way, but didn't. What she did next would defy the law of men, the mercy of God, and the silence of the desert itself. Because sometimes, innocence is the bravest thing alive. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The sun bore down like a judgment, a burning eye that showed no mercy, no shade, no salvation. The man lay half buried in the coarse red dirt of the Texas plains, his breath shallow, each inhale clawing against the weight of death pressing down on him. His name was Eli Harper, U.S. Marshal once, ghost of a man now. His badge caught what little light the day had left to give, glinting once before being swallowed by a smear of blood and dust. His horse was gone, stolen by the same men who'd sworn loyalty to him, men he'd called brothers. He could still hear the echo of their laughter as they rode away, a cruel harmony fading into the horizon, leaving him with nothing but the sound of his own dying heartbeat. The air shimmered, heat rippling like the surface of a furnace. Sweat and blood mixed on his brow, trailing into the cracks of parched skin. He tried to move, his fingers twitched, scraping the dry earth. The pain was blinding, sharp as a knife in the gut, but beneath it was something worse, the knowledge of betrayal, of trust turned to poison. He had seen the ambush coming too late. One moment, he was leading the posse after a band of silver thieves. The next, the muzzle flash of his deputy's rifle burned in his memory. The bullet hit him high in the back, spinning him from his saddle. Then came the dirt, the trampling hooves, the dust clouds swallowing the faces of men he once shared coffee and campfire stories with. They didn't look back. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they didn't care. He'd never know. Now the world had narrowed to the taste of iron on his tongue and the cruel rhythm of the desert wind. Somewhere far above, a circle of vultures drifted, black wings slicing through the sky. They knew. The scavengers always knew. He wanted to curse them, but the words caught in his throat, swallowed by the dryness that had turned his mouth into a grave. The plains stretched out in every direction, empty, endless, unforgiving. Once, Eli had loved this land. He'd believed the frontier was where a man could start over, carve justice out of wilderness. Now it was his coffin. He thought of his daughter, Sarah, her small hands clutching his hat brim as she laughed, sunlight caught in her hair. That was years ago, before fever took her, before his wife followed her into the ground. Maybe that's why he took the badge. Maybe that's why he believed chasing down bad men could fill the hollow that grief left behind. But as the heat pressed harder, the badge felt heavier on his chest, as if the two knew it had failed him. His breath came slower now, each want to fight. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain that would never come. He tried to reach for his revolver, just inches away, half buried in sand, but his arm refused to listen. His fingers brushed the metal, then stopped. The effort stole what little strength he had left. A groan escaped him, low and ragged, lost to the empty expanse. The sky blurred, his vision dimming. The sound of the riders was gone now, swallowed by distance and time. All that remained was silence, and the endless hum of the desert, singing him toward death. And yet, in that silence, a flicker of movement stirred, a shadow crossing the light, small and uncertain. Eli's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw someone, something, moving toward him from the horizon. Then the darkness took him. The wind carried dust through the hollow remains of the settlement, whispering through the empty doorframes and the half-buried wagons like a ghost too tired to haunt. Clara trudged barefoot along the edge of what used to be her world. 10 cabins, a dry well, and a chapel whose bell hadn't rung since the raid. She was 9, though the sun and sorrow had aged her face into something harder. In her arms, she carried a ragged doll named Lila, its button eyes dulled by dirt and its once pink dress now the color of ash. The doll was all she had left of her mother, and though the seams were splitting, she held it as though it were life itself. Hunger gnawed at her belly, sharp and relentless. For days she had scavenged among the ashes, hoping to find something, anything, that the raiders hadn't taken or burned. Once, this place had been alive. She could still hear the echoes sometimes, the sound of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter from the saloon at dusk, her father's boots on the porch. But the night the riders came, everything changed. She remembered the thunder of hooves, the screams, the fire swallowing the sky. Her parents had hidden her in the root cellar, whispering promises they couldn't keep. When the noise finally stopped and she crept out, the world was gone. Bodies lay like broken dolls in the dust, the sky choked with smoke, the wind heavy with the smell of iron and death. She had waited for them to come back, for days that stretched into weeks. But no one came. The well dried, the food ran out, and even the coyotes stopped howling. She learned to move with the dawn and rest in the shade of burnt beams, her small form invisible against the ruins. Today, though, something inside her had shifted. Hunger had grown teeth, and fear had dulled into numbness. She wrapped her mother's scarf tighter around her neck and stepped beyond the edge of town, the place her father once said never to go. The plains stretched wide and endless, a shimmering ocean of golden heat. The wind was harsh, pulling at her hair, but she kept walking, her small figure a fragile defiance against the horizon. Each step crunched over brittle grass and sun-cracked earth. She spoke softly to Lila as she went, her voice hoarse from thirst. "We'll find water soon," she promised, though she didn't believe it. Maybe someone's out there. The doll's head bobbed in her arms, silent but listening. She stopped once to look back. The town seemed smaller now, shrinking into memory, a cluster of bones scattered by time. She wondered if her parents were watching from somewhere she couldn't see, if they knew she'd kept walking. A hawk circled above, its cry cutting through the silence. Clara's eyes followed it until it disappeared into the glare of the sun. Then she saw something, dark shapes far off in the distance, swirling against the sky. At first, she thought it was smoke, maybe a fire. But the movement was too slow, too deliberate. Buzzards. Her heart thudded unevenly. She'd seen them before, after the raid. They only gathered for one reason. She hesitated, her small fingers gripping the doll tighter. Fear told her to turn back. But another voice, quiet and stubborn, whispered that maybe someone was still alive out there. Maybe someone needed her. She took a deep breath, the air hot and dry in her lungs, and kept walking toward the circling shadows. The plains stretched before her like an ocean of fire, every blade of grass crisp to gold beneath the merciless sun, every breath a struggle against heat and emptiness. Clara shaded her eyes with a trembling hand, squinting toward the horizon where the air shimmered and danced, blurring distance and truth alike. There, above the molten line between earth and sky, she saw them, black wings circling slow and patient, the way buzzards always did when something below them had stopped moving. For a long moment, she stood still, her bare feet burning against the cracked earth, her small frame rigid as a fence post. The wind tugged at her hair, dry strands clinging to her face, and she thought of her father's words from long ago. Where the buzzards fly, there's death, Clara. Keep clear of it. But those words belonged to another time, a time when there had still been someone to protect her. Now there was only the ache of hunger in her stomach, the ache of loneliness deeper still, and that dark, magnetic pull of something unknown waiting out there. She looked down at the doll cradled in her arm. Lila's stitched smile faded but unbroken, and whispered, "Maybe it's just an animal." The wind didn't answer, only carried the distant croak of the birds circling above. She hesitated, one foot forward, then another, the decision made not by courage but by the quiet voice inside her that refused to turn away from anything that might still breathe. The journey toward the buzzards took her farther than she expected. The sun hung heavy, smothering her in waves of light so bright it hurt to look ahead. She stumbled more than once, her legs weak from days of too little food and too much walking, but she kept her eyes on the circling shapes. Each step was a battle between fear and something else, a strange, stubborn hope that maybe someone needed her, and that helping them would mean she wasn't so alone in the world. As she drew closer, the air changed. It smelled wrong, metallic, like old coins and smoke, the kind of scent that makes you think of endings. The buzzards lifted higher when they saw her, cautious, resentful that a small girl dared disturb their meal. Beneath their slow spiral, something glinted faintly in the dirt. Clara stopped, her heart hammering, and for the first time she wished she hadn't come. The shape on the ground wasn't an animal. It was a man. He lay face down, one arm half buried in sand, his clothes torn and dark with blood. His hat was gone, his skin cracked from sun and sweat. A badge caught the light near his shoulder, a silver star, dull with dust. Claire's breath hitched. She had seen a badge like that once, on a marshal who came through town before the raid. Her father had said men with stars on their chests were supposed to keep people safe. But this one looked anything but safe. He looked broken. She took a cautious step forward, her voice small and uncertain. "Mister?" No answer. The buzzards shifted above her, impatient. She swallowed hard, clutching her doll tighter, and tried again. "Mister, are you alive?" Still nothing but the hum of flies and the rasp of wind through brittle grass. She crept closer until she was near enough to see the rise and fall of his back. Shallow, slow, but there. A sound escaped her then, a mix of fear and relief. Someone was alive. Someone still breathing on this dead stretch of land. Her throat burned as she knelt beside him, brushing sand from his face. He was older than her father had been, his beard rough, his features hard even in unconsciousness. His lips were split, and when she poured the last of her water onto a scrap of cloth and pressed it to his mouth, he stirred faintly, mumbling words she couldn't understand. The badge gleamed again in the sunlight, and Clara stared at it, wondering who would leave a man like this to die. She didn't know that the men who had done it were already miles away, or that the choice she made in that moment, to stay, to help, would bind her life to his in ways neither of them could yet imagine. All she knew was that the plains were vast, the dead were many, and this one man, for some reason she couldn't name, wasn't meant to join them yet. The man's breath came in shallow, rattling gasps, each one sounding like it might be his last. His skin was burned the color of clay, blistered where the sun had claimed him, and the air around him shimmered with heat and a sour stench of dried blood. Clara knelt beside him, the earth searing her knees through the thin fabric of her dress, and for a long time she just stared, at the stillness of him, at the way his hand twitched once, then went limp again, as though even his body couldn't decide whether to keep fighting or surrender. His lips moved, faintly, words escaping like ghosts. "McCrae. The silver. Dell killed them all." The voice was raw, broken, but something in the sound of it made her flinch. It wasn't just pain, it was fear, or warning, or both. She leaned closer, her shadow falling across his face, trying to block the merciless glare of the sun. His eyes fluttered open for a heartbeat, cloudy and unfocused, and she could see the reflection of the sky in them, endless, empty, pitiless. He didn't see her, not yet. Maybe he was seeing someone else, someone long gone. His head turned slightly, lips cracked and trembling. "Sarah," he whispered, almost tenderly. Before his breath hitched and he coughed, a wet sound that made Clara's stomach twist. She didn't know who Sarah was, but the name felt heavy, full of loss. She wanted to ask him who McCrae was too, and what silver he meant, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, her gaze drifted to the star pinned crookedly to his chest. The badge was tarnished, smeared with dirt and dried blood, but still it caught the light like a fragment of something sacred. Clara reached out, hesitant, her fingers hovering just above it. She'd never held anything like it before, something that meant law, order, protection. Her father used to tell her stories about lawmen who rode across the plains keeping people safe, but she'd stopped believing in those stories the night the raiders came. And yet, here one lay before her, dying under the same sky that had watched her world burn. When her fingertips brushed the badge, it was hot, almost too hot to touch, as if it still carried the heat of all that had happened. She drew her hand back with a soft gasp, then pressed it to her chest, feeling her heartbeat thudding wild beneath her ribs. The man stirred again, muttering incoherently, his hands twitching at his sides. Clara bit her lip, torn between fear and the strange, powerful pull that kept her from running. The buzzards still circled above them, closer now, shadows crossing the ground in slow, cruel arcs. She glanced up at them, her jaw tightening. "Go away," she whispered, voice trembling but fierce. They didn't listen. Of course, they never did, but saying it made her feel stronger, like she could push back against the silence closing in around them both. She looked back at the marshal, noticing now the deep wound in his side, dark and crusted with blood. It looked terrible, but there was something worse in the way his face had gone gray beneath the sunburn, the way his breathing rasped like wind through broken reeds. She didn't know what to do. She had no medicine, no water left. All she had was a scrap of hope and the will not to let another person die if she could stop it. Her mother used to say mercy was a kind of courage, the hardest kind. Clara didn't feel brave. She just felt sorry for him, and tired of the way death kept finding her no matter where she went. She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and dabbed at the blood on his neck, whispering nonsense words, the way her mother had when Clara was sick. "You're gonna be all right, mister," she said softly, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. "You just gotta hold on a little while longer." The words trembled in the air between them, fragile and fleeting, but somehow they made her feel less alone. When she looked at him again, his breathing had steadied just a little, and though the sun still burned mercilessly above them, she thought, just for a second, that maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't done with him yet. For a long time, Clara just knelt there beside the dying lawman, staring at the man who had fallen out of the world and into her path as if the desert itself had chosen to put him there. The wind moved around them, a slow, hollow sigh that picked up dust and scattered it across his wounds, across her small, bare feet, across the endless horizon that offered no comfort and no witness. The sun was slanting west, its heat still fierce, pressing down on her shoulders like a warning. Leave him, go back, save yourself. Every story she'd ever heard whispered by grown-ups in the dark corners of campfires told her what happened to those who lingered on the plains. The desert didn't forgive mercy. The desert took whatever lingered too long. She thought of her father then, his rough hands, his voice when he'd tell her that kind hearts didn't survive out here. "You can't save what's already gone, Clara," he'd said once, after finding a coyote pup half dead by the well. He'd taken it behind the barn and ended its suffering with one clean motion. She'd hated him for that, for the coldness in his eyes when he walked back inside without another word. But now, looking at the marshal, she wasn't sure if her father had been cruel or just afraid of the world's cruelty. The man's face was gray, his breath shallow, each one sounding like it might be the last. She could walk away. She could tell herself it wasn't her burden, that she was only a child, that the desert had already decided his fate, but something deep in her chest refused. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the hollow ache of wanting to believe that not everything had to end in loss. She looked down at her canteen, its metal surface dull with scratches, and shook it gently. The sound was faint, too faint. There couldn't have been more than a few swallows left inside. Her tongue was thick with thirst, her lips split and bleeding from the dry air. But when she looked at the man again, she saw her father lying there. Not truly him, of course, but some echo of him, the same rough beard, the same tired lines around the mouth, the same quiet dignity that came from carrying too much for too long. She pressed her fingers to her temple, her head spinning with the heat, then unscrewed the canteen's cap with trembling hands. "Don't die," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, the words carried away almost instantly by the wind. He didn't move. She leaned closer, shadows beginning to stretch across the plain, and poured a few drops of water onto the corner of her ragged scarf. The moment the fabric darkened, she felt the weight of her decision settle deep inside her chest. She touched the wet cloth to his lips, slow and careful, afraid the sudden coolness might startle him. His mouth twitched, his throat working weakly as if trying to swallow. She tilted the canteen and let a few drops fall directly onto his tongue. It wasn't enough, not nearly, but it was something. She pulled the canteen back and stared at it, half wanting to shake out the last drops into her own mouth, half unable to. Her hands were shaking now, the edges of her vision swimming. She had given away the last of what stood between her and death, and she knew it. Yet, as she looked at him, she felt a strange calm settle in her chest, like the world had paused to watch her defy it. "You're not dying today," she murmured. "Not while I'm here." The man stirred faintly, a rough sound leaving his throat, his eyelids flickering but not opening. She almost smiled, just a small, fleeting curl of her lips. For the first time since the raid, she wasn't alone. The sun dipped lower, painting the plains in fire and shadow. The buzzards, still circling, had begun to drift farther out, uncertain now. The air cooled slightly, the wind carrying a low hum like a promise, or maybe a warning. Clara sat beside him as the light faded, clutching the empty canteen to her chest and the doll to her knees. She had made her choice. The desert might take her for it. But she couldn't walk away. Not from him. Not from the faint, fragile proof that something still breathed in this dead world. If you've ridden this far with us, dip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. The desert bled into dusk, the horizon melting from gold to violet as the last of the day's heat retreated into the earth. Clara sat hunched over a small circle of stones, coaxing a fire from a handful of brittle twigs she'd scavenged along the way. The flame caught slowly, trembling like a frightened animal before blooming into a fragile orange pulse against the encroaching dark. She shielded it with her hands, feeding it pieces of dry grass, watching sparks leap upward only to vanish into the widening night. The lawman lay a few feet away, half shrouded in shadow, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. His skin looked waxen in the fading light, his beard thick with dust, his badge still faintly glinting beneath a layer of grime that clung to everything here. The buzzards had gone now, too dark for their kind, but the coyotes had begun to sing, their howls echoing across the empty plains like distant lamentations. Clara felt their voices press against her heart. Loneliness had a sound, she realized, and it wasn't silence. It was that endless call and response of things searching for one another in the dark. She pulled her knees to her chest and hugged her doll tight, whispering to it the way she had when the nights in the cellar had stretched too long after the raid. "He's still breathing," she said softly to Lila. "He's trying to stay." The doll, head slumped to the side, offered no comfort, but her voice made the night feel less empty. A sound came from the man then, a low groan, half pain, half confusion. Clara turned quickly, eyes wide, and saw his eyelids flutter. He blinked once, twice, as if dragging himself out of a long, dark dream. The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time, she saw his eyes, pale, gray-blue like the morning sky after rain. They struggled to focus, darting from the fire to the endless night, before settling on her. He didn't speak at first, just stared as if unsure what he was seeing. To him, she must have looked like a mirage, a small, dirt-smudged girl sitting vigil beside a dying man, her hair tangled, her face hollow with hunger but lit by something steadier than fear. "You," he rasped finally, his voice cracked and weak, each syllable costing effort. "You're real?" She nodded slowly, unsure whether to answer out loud, unsure what to say to a man who looked half dead. His head dropped back with a sigh, the effort of speech draining what little strength he had. But as he lay there, the firelight's flicker stirred the ghosts behind his eyes. He saw the ambush again. The canyon had been alive with gunfire, his own men shouting over the roar of bullets. They had cornered the outlaws, or so he'd thought. But the trap had never been for them. It had been for him. The silver, 30 bars of it, stolen from a mining shipment, had changed everything. Greed had eaten through loyalty like rust through steel. McCrae, his deputy of 5 years, the man who'd stood beside him in gunfights, had been the first to raise his rifle. The memory burned through the haze of fever, the gunshot's bite in his back, the sudden weightlessness as he fell from his horse, the laughter as they stripped him of his water, his horse, his hope. McCrae, he murmured, the name spilling out before he could stop it. Clara tilted her head, not understanding, only hearing the pain behind the word. He looked at her again, his gaze softening. "Why? Are you here?" He managed to ask, though the question wasn't just about her presence. It was about the world, about the miracle of mercy in a place so void of it. She didn't answer, only reached toward the fire, breaking a stick in two to feed the flame. The sound of it snapping echoed quietly in the night. For a long time, they said nothing. The wind picked up, cool and sharp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. The marshal's eyes drifted to the fire, and he thought of the men who'd betrayed him, their faces twisted by greed, their laughter ringing louder than his own gun. He thought of Sarah, his little girl, gone before her time, and how this child's face now flickered in the same uncertain glow, her small features both strange and familiar. A child saving what men had destroyed. His eyes closed again, not in surrender this time, but in something gentler, a fragile, flickering gratitude. Clara watched him drift back into unconsciousness, her small shoulders sagging with exhaustion. She leaned closer to the fire, its warmth brushing her skin, and whispered to the night, "You're not alone anymore." The wind carried her words out into the dark, over the sleeping plains, where the coyote's song fell silent for just a moment, as if the desert itself had paused to listen. The night had settled heavy over the plains, the kind that swallowed sound and light alike until only the fire's faint glow dared to breathe. The stars came sharp and countless above, cold witnesses to the quiet below. Clara sat close to the embers, her small hands cupped around their fragile warp. When the stillness broke, it began as a tremor in the dirt, a deep, rhythmic thudding that rolled up from the ground and into her bones. Hoofbeats, far off at first, then growing louder, faster, like a storm galloping closer with every heartbeat. Her breath caught. Her first instinct was to look at the marshal. Eli lay unmoving, his face pale even in the dim firelight, his chest rising only slightly beneath the blanket of her torn shawl. He was too weak to stand, too weak even to open his eyes. The hoofbeats drew nearer, and with them came the sound of men, low voices, laughter rough as gravel. She didn't think, didn't plan. Panic took her by the shoulders and made her move. She smothered the fire with her hands, kicking sand over the sparks until they hissed and died. The world plunged into darkness, and she was left blinking against the sudden void. The moon hung thin and cold overhead, silvering the edges of the brush and the curve of Eli's badge. She looked around wildly, her heart slamming against her ribs, and then she saw it. A patch of tall, dry sage a few yards off, thick enough to hide him if she moved fast enough. Her hands shook as she tried to lift him. He was heavier than she'd expected, his body limp as a sack of grain. She gritted her teeth, whispering between breaths, "Come on, mister. Please." His head lolled against her shoulder, a low groan escaping him, but still he didn't wait. When she finally reached the brush, she shoved him beneath it, piling dry branches over his legs, his arms, his face, anything that would break the shine of moonlight on flesh. The badge glinted once, and she hesitated, then took a handful of dirt and threw it over it until it dulled. The hoofbeats slowed. The riders were close now, close enough that she could hear them breathing, smelt the leather and sweat and whiskey that clung to them. She pressed herself low to the ground beside the brush, clutching her doll so tightly its fabric door. The men's shadows loomed long and distorted across the grass as they came into view, 3 of them, mounted, their silhouettes black against the ghost white of the moonlit horizon. One of them spat, the sound loud and wet in the silence. "Ain't no man survives this far out," he said, his voice carrying a lazy drawl. The others laughed, harsh and mean, the kind of laughter that didn't come from humor but from cruelty well-fed. McCrae said he took one in the back. Another replied, "Left him for the buzzards. Don't reckon there's anything left but bones." The name made Clara's stomach twist. McCrae. She remembered it from the marshal's fevered mumbling. The riders circled once, scanning the dark, their eyes glinting like animals. One dismounted and crouched near the spot where the fire had been. He picked up a handful of sand, sniffed, frowned. "Somebody's been here," he muttered. Clara froze, every muscle locking tight, her breath burning in her chest. The man stood, glancing around. "Could have been days ago," another said. "Ain't no trail left worth chasing." After a moment's pause, the first man grunted, tossed the sand aside, and swung back into his saddle. They lingered only a few minutes longer, talking in low voices about silver, about betrayal, about how no one would ever find what they'd taken. Then, with a sharp whistle and a tug of reins, they turned their horses and rode off, their laughter echoing into the dark like a curse. Clara didn't move until the sound of hoofs faded back into the distance, until the night went still again. Only then did she crawl from the dirt, shaking, her heart still galloping inside her chest. She looked toward the brush where Eli lay hidden, and for a moment, the moonlight touched her face, half fear, half defiance. They thought he was dead. They thought no man could survive this far out. But as she brushed the dirt from his shoulder and whispered, "They're gone now," she realized something that made her shiver despite the heat still clinging to the night. Those men were wrong, and before long, they'd learn just how wrong. The fever took him with the rising sun, crawling through his veins like wildfire, twisting breath into shallow gasps and words into broken fragments. Eli Harper lay beneath the rough shelter of the sagebrush where Clara had hidden him, the world around him fading into a blur of gold and shadow. His skin burned beneath her touch, sweat pooling along his temples, his body trembling with the strain of whatever haunted him in the dark corners of his mind. His lips moved constantly, whispering names she didn't know: McCrae, Harlan, the Silver. Each one choked out between ragged breaths. Then the tone of his voice shifted, softening into something fragile, something almost tender, and a different name fell from his cracked lips: Sarah. The sound of it made Clara flinch. The name hung in the air, delicate and aching, like the echo of something long buried that still refused to die. She didn't know who Sarah was, but she could feel the weight of her in that single word. The love, the loss, the guilt all tangled together. It made her chest tighten, because she'd heard her own name said that way once, before the world burned, before the riders came. She leaned closer, pressing her ear near his mouth, trying to make sense of the rest, but his voice slipped back into fevered murmurs, tangled between past and present. In his delirium, Eli was no longer under the open Texas sky. He was back in the canyon, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and betrayal. The flash of rifles, the cries of men, the roar of the ambush, it all replayed behind his eyelids in savage clarity. He saw McCrae's smirk, that half-laugh twisting under his beard as he raised his gun, eyes gleaming with something colder than greed. "Nothing personal, Marshal," McCrae had said before the muzzle flashed and the world turned red. Eli remembered falling, remembered the shock more than the pain, the disbelief that the man who'd shared his campfires, who'd once pulled him from a flood, could sell him for silver. He saw the coins again, spilling from the torn saddlebag as the outlaws divided the spoils, 30 bars of bright, cursed metal glinting in the desert sun, each one heavier than the souls it bought. The sound of them hitting the ground clattered through his skull like gunshots. "You'll hang for this," he tried to say, but the words came out as blood instead of breath. In the fever's grip, that moment replayed over and over, the betrayal, the fall, the laughter fading as they left him to the buzzards. But between flashes of that nightmare came another vision, softer, sweeter, cutting through the pain like the memory of rain after drought. A little girl in a yellow dress, standing in a field of wildflowers, sunlight in her hair. "Sarah," he whispered again, reaching toward her in the dream. She turned to him, smiling the way only a child could, before her form blurred into light and the world snapped back to heat and sand and death. Clara sat beside him through it all, her knees drawn to her chest, the doll resting forgotten in her lap. She watched his face twist and twitch, saw his hands clench at invisible ghosts, and though she didn't understand everything he muttered, she understood enough. The sound of pain was the same in every language, every life. When he called her Sarah again, softer this time, she didn't correct him. She just reached for his hand and held it, her small fingers wrapping around his rough, trembling ones. His skin was burning, but she didn't let go. "I'm here," she whispered, not sure if she was lying, not sure if he could even hear her. The wind had picked up, carrying dust across the plains, the air filled with the faint scent of coming rain that never reached the ground. She watched the light fade from the sky, turning the world the color of rust and sorrow, and wondered what kind of man he'd been before the desert broke him. His fevered words painted a picture of a man betrayed, abandoned, left for dead, but also a father who had once loved a little girl so fiercely that even dying couldn't erase her name from his tongue. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them back, pressing his hand tighter. "Rest now," she whispered. "You're safe." The wind carried her words into the dying day, but the desert, as always, kept its silence. And in that silence, Eli's breathing steadied, the fever easing slightly, as if the ghost of his daughter had found him again. Just this time, in the shape of another child who refused to leave, the first light of dawn crept slow over the plains, spilling a pale, ghostly gold across the dust and brittle grass, catching in Clara's tangled hair as she stirred awake beside the dying fire. The night had been long and cruel, filled with the rasp of the marshal's fever breathing and the low howl of coyotes somewhere out in the black. When the horizon finally split with light, she sat up, blinking against the ache behind her eyes. Her tongue felt like sandpaper, her lips cracked and stinging with every breath. The canteen, once her lifeline, lay beside her, empty, useless, the metal cool against her fingertips. She looked at the man lying a few feet away, his chest barely moving, his skin pale beneath the grime and sweat. The night had taken what strength he had left. His pulse fluttered weakly beneath his throat, and the sound of his breathing came slower now, shallow as the desert wind. She knew if she didn't find water soon, the next time she looked at him, he'd be still. She swallowed hard, her throat scraping like dry bark, and glanced at the horizon. Somewhere, out there, there had to be something, a creek bed, a hollow, a place the land hadn't yet forgotten how to live. The thought of walking back into that endless expanse made her chest tighten with fear, but she pushed it down. He had fought to stay alive through pain and betrayal and heat. The least she could do was fight a little, too. She tore a strip from her dress, tying it around her wrist as a token, a reminder to find her way back, and whispered a promise to the unconscious man, "I'll come back. Don't die yet." Then she turned toward the rising sun and began to walk. The land stretched empty and cruel before her, the ground hard and cracked under her bare feet, the air already warming with the promise of another merciless day. She followed what looked like a shallow trail, a line where the earth had dipped long ago, where maybe, once, water had flowed. The track led her past skeletons of trees and the brittle remains of sagebrush that crumbled when she touched them. Her legs ached, her skin burned, and her head swam from thirst. But she kept walking, talking quietly to her doll, to herself, to the silence. "He's still breathing," she muttered. "He's strong. He'll wait for me." Hours passed. She lost track of time entirely, until the ground began to slope downward. Ahead, a gash in the earth stretched like a wound, the bed of an old creek long since surrendered to drown. She ran the last few steps, hope rising like a spark in her chest, only to drop to her knees when she saw it. Nothing but dust, mud hard and stone, and a few dark patches where moisture clung stubbornly beneath the surface. Still, she dug. With both hands, she clawed at the dirt until her nails bled, scooping up handfuls of gritty soil, chasing the faint glimmer of dampness below. The deeper she went, the cooler it became, until finally her fingers touched something soft and wet. She gasped, a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, and pressed her strip of cloth into the mud, squeezing until the faintest drops of murky water bled through. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to try, enough to hope. The journey back was slower. The sun was crueler now, her feet torn and bleeding, her body moving on nothing but stubborn will. By the time she saw the faint rise of the hill where she'd left him, her vision blurred at the edges, black spots swimming before her eyes. She stumbled to her knees beside him, chest heaving, and pressed the damp cloth to his lips. At first, he didn't move. Panic clawed up her throat, sharp and cold. "Please," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "You can't die now. I brought it. I found water." Then, faintly, his mouth twitched. His throat worked. A groan escaped him, deep and rough like thunder rolling in the distance. His eyes flickered open for the briefest moment, unfocused but alive. "You came back," he rasped, his voice a shadow of itself. She nodded quickly, tears streaking her dust-covered cheeks. "Told you I would." He drank again, just a little, and though he soon drifted back into sleep, his breathing steadied, deeper now, surer. Clara sat back, exhausted but smiling faintly, clutching the empty, mud-stained cloth in her lap. She had nothing left, no food, no water, no strength. But when she looked at him, something inside her felt whole for the first time since the brave. She had saved him again, not with bullets or strength, but with hope, fragile and foolish though it was. The wind whispered low across the plains, and for once, it didn't sound like morning. It sounded like promise. The sun hung high and merciless, but for the first time in days, its light didn't feel like a death sentence. When Eli Harper opened his eyes, the world came back to him in fragments, heat shimmering above the dirt, the smell of smoke and sage, and the faint rustle of small movements nearby. His vision blurred before sharpening on a tiny figure crouched beside him. A girl, her hands cupped around a scrap of cloth dripping with the last of some muddy water. She looked half ghost, half angel, her hair matted, her skin pale beneath the grime. But her eyes, those steady, brown eyes, held something he hadn't seen in a long, long time, defiance wrapped in innocence. For a moment, he thought he was still dreaming. His fever had dragged him through memories of betrayal and loss, through the faces of the dead, until all that remained was her voice, whispering through the haze. Now that same voice spoke again, quiet but certain. "You're awake." He swallowed, his throat raw, the word that came out more air than sound. "You saved me." She gave a small shrug, glancing down at the doll in her lap. "Didn't want you to die." The simplicity of it struck him like a bullet. No reward, no reason, no understanding of what it meant to risk yourself for a stranger. Just kindness, pure and impossible, in a world that had forgotten the word. Shame crawled through him, deeper than the pain in his side. He was a lawman, sworn to protect people like her, and yet here he was, a broken man alive only because a child had refused to leave him behind. He tried to sit up, his muscles screaming in protest, and she moved quickly to steady him, small hands surprisingly firm beneath his shoulder. "Easy," she said, mimicking a tone she must have heard from her parents once. He winced, but managed to push himself upright, the world spinning before settling into focus. The badge still hung heavy on his chest, dull beneath a layer of dried blood. He touched it briefly, then looked at her again. "You got a name, little one?" She hesitated, as if names had become something fragile to guard. "Clara," she said finally. He nodded once, the motion slow. "Clara," he repeated, tasting the word like a promise. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, empty, endless, cruel. He knew the men who left him out here wouldn't stop at betrayal. McCrae and his lot would burn anything that tied back to their crime. And if they found this girl, his stomach turned cold. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said softly. "The desert's no place for mercy." She frowned at that, the defiance returning to her eyes. "Then how come you're still breathing?" He almost smiled, but there was no humor in it, just a kind of sorrow that cut deeper than pain. They sat in silence for a while, the wind tugging at the edges of their ragged shelter. He could feel the weakness still in him, the tremor in his hands when he tried to reach for the revolver half buried beside him. His fingers brushed the worn metal, and for a moment he considered leaving it there. A dying man didn't need a gun. But then he looked at her again, this small, fierce creature who had dragged him back from death's edge, and he felt something shift inside him, something long buried beneath guilt and loss. If he lived through this, if he found the strength again, he would see her safe, no matter what it took. He drew in a slow breath, the kind that tasted of iron and resolve, and held out the revolver toward her. She blinked, startled. "You ever shoot before?" he asked. She shook her head. "Good," he said, managing the faintest smirk. "Means you ain't made the mistakes the rest of us have." He showed her how to check the chamber, how to load a single bullet with careful hands. His voice was low, deliberate, as if he were teaching her something sacred. "Don't point it unless you mean it," he said. "And don't mean it unless you've got no other choice." She nodded, repeating the motions as he guided her trembling hands, his own shaking with exhaustion. When she looked up at him again, there was no fear in her face, only understanding. "You're gonna get better," she said, a simple truth she refused to doubt. He looked away, the horizon shimmering like fire, and whispered a vow only the wind could hear. "If I do, Clara, I'll see you home. Whatever's left of it." Then, as the sun dipped low behind them, he closed his eyes, not to rest, but to gather strength for the road that waited, and for the debt he owed to a child who had given him back his soul. If you've ridden this far with us, dip your hat and it's subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. By the time Eli Harper could stand, the sun had turned the sky into a sheet of molten gold, and the air shimmered like breath over a forge. His body protested every movement. His ribs ached where the bullet had grazed. His legs trembled beneath him, and his head spun with a strange mix of weakness and will that comes after nearly dying. But he was alive. Against all odds, he was alive, and it was because of the small girl now crouched a few feet away, digging through the dirt with her bare hands. Clara had taken to the work with the same quiet determination she'd shown since the day he first opened his eyes to her face. He leaned against a weathered post of sage, one hand clutching his side, watching her as she sifted through the dust and pebbles, humming softly to herself. Her doll, missing an arm now, sat propped nearby like a silent companion. The world felt heavy with silence, the kind that comes after a storm, a fragile stillness that dared not be broken. Then, suddenly, Clara let out a small gasp and straightened, her eyes wide. In her palm, half buried moments ago, lay his badge. The metal was dulled, its once polished surface marred by scratches and dry blood, the edges crusted with dust. Yet even under the dirt, the five-pointed star caught the light, glinting faintly like a stubborn ghost of something long gone. Clara turned it over in her small hands, her thumb tracing the engraving along the edge, U.S. Marshal. To her, it looked like a relic, something important, something holy. "It's yours, ain't it?" she asked, her voice small but sure. Eli's throat tightened. For a long while, he couldn't answer. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and she placed the badge in his palm. It felt heavier than he remembered, as though it carried the weight of all the years he'd worn it, all the lives it had failed to protect. He rubbed the grime away with his thumb, revealing the dull gleam beneath. "What's it mean?" Claire asked, watching him closely, her head tilted just so. There was no accusation in her tone, no judgment, just the simple curiosity of a child trying to make sense of a world that never made any. Eli stared at the star for a long time, his reflection warped in its battered surface. A dozen memories passed through his mind, the men he'd arrested, the towns he'd defended, the graves he'd dug for those he couldn't save. He thought of McCrae and the others, of the greed that had poisoned them, of how they'd traded honor for silver. He thought of the blood on his hands, some Regis, some not. "It used to mean something," he said finally, his voice low and rough, a confession more than an answer. The words hung between them, carried off by the wind. Clara frowned, not fully understanding. "Don't it anymore?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her right away. He just kept staring at the badge, turning it over and over, like he might find the answer hidden in the grooves of the metal. "A badge don't make a man good," he said at last. "It just tells folks he's supposed to be." He let out a breath that sounded too much like a sigh. But there's plenty of men wearing stars who forget what that means. He thought of McCrae's smirk, the glint of silver in the sun, and the cold laughter of betrayal echoing in his skull. "Guess I was one of them too, once." Clara's brow furrowed. She looked at him, then at the badge, then back again, as if she could see straight through the years he carried. "You ain't bad," she said simply. "You got hurt." The innocence in her voice cut through him sharper than any blade. He looked away, unable to hold her gaze, and closed his fingers around the star until the edges bit into his palm. The silence stretched long after that, filled only by the hum of wind through dry grass and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Eli finally pinned the badge back to his vest, though the gesture felt different now, less of a claim, more of a burden shouldered once more. He turned his eyes toward the horizon, where the light bled red and gold, and felt something stir, a spark of the man he'd once been, the one who'd believed justice still meant something. Clara stood beside him, her small shadow stretching beside his in the dying light. Neither spoke again, because there was nothing left to say. The desert had heard the truth already, and it was enough. The morning broke cold and gray, the kind of light that seemed to strip the world bare, showing every scar the land had ever known. A thin veil of mist hung low over the plains, curling around the jagged rocks and brittle sage like smoke from a long dead fire. Eli Harper adjusted the frayed reins in his hand, his fingers stiff with the ache that had become part of him since the ambush. Beside him, Clara rode quiet, her small frame almost swallowed by the horse's back, her legs barely reaching the stirrups. The animal was a scrawny, dust-colored mare they'd found half-starved a mile from camp, grazing near a dried-up creek bed. Clara had fed her bits of dried grass and whispered to her like she was something sacred. Now, the creature carried them both, an unlikely trio, wounded, weary, but moving west with the grim determination of those who have nowhere else to go. The wagon ruts stretched before them, carved deep into the earth, two parallel scars leading into the horizon. Eli had known men like McCrae all his life, cowards who smiled in the daylight and slit throats in the dark. He'd ridden with them, bled beside them, trusted them, and they'd sold him out for silver that would never buy them peace. He could almost see it, the canyon camped out between the red cliffs, the smoke of their fires curling upward, the echo of their laughter carried on the wind. He knew that place. He knew it too well. Clara didn't understand why they were riding toward danger. She didn't understand vengeance, not the way he did. To her, the world was divided by a simpler law, those who left and those who stayed. And Eli had stayed. That was enough for her. How much farther? She asked, her voice breaking the long silence. He glanced at her, her face shadowed beneath the wide-brimmed hat he'd trimmed to fit her. A day, maybe two, he said, his voice rough but steady. If we keep the trail. She nodded, though she didn't ask what waited at the end of it. He was grateful for that silence, because he didn't have the heart to tell her. He'd seen too much of the world's cruelty to dress it up in soft words. He wasn't riding toward justice, not anymore. He was riding toward reckoning. The badge on his chest caught the faintest gleam of morning light, but it didn't make him feel righteous. It just reminded him of what had been lost, of the men who'd worn the same star and turned it into a lie. He looked at Claire again, her tiny hands gripping the saddle horn, her eyes scanning the horizon with a kind of cautious wonder. She'd already seen too much for her years. He swore to himself she wouldn't see more than she had too. As the sun climbed higher, the mist burned away, revealing the vastness of the land, rolling plains giving way to jagged mesas and deep ravines that sliced the earth open like old wounds. They rode in silence, the rhythmic clop of hooves their only companion. The wind carried the smell of dust and distant rain, the kind that never reached the ground. Every so often, Eli's hand would drift to the revolver at his hip, his thumb brushing the worn grip, the muscle memory of violence stirring like an old ache. But when he looked at Clara, something in him softened, the rage cooling beneath the quiet weight of her trust. "You ever been to the canyon lands?" he asked suddenly. She shook her head. "My pa said the world ends out there," she said, almost to herself. Eli managed a faint, crooked smile. He wasn't too far off. The land did seem to end that way, falling away into deep red shadows and narrow trails that only men with death in their eyes dared to follow. By dusk, they'd made camp beneath the ridge, the dying sun painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Clara gathered kindling while Eli cleaned the gun, each click and motion precise, deliberate. She watched him silently, her small brow furrowed. "You're gonna find them, aren't you?" she said finally. He paused, the revolver heavy in his hand. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "I'm gonna find them." She looked at him for a long time, then said, "They hurt you?" He nodded. "They did." Her voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "You won't let them hurt me too?" The question pierced deeper than any bullet could. Eli looked into the fire, the flames flickering in his tired eyes. "Not while I draw breath, Clara," he said. The wind rose, carrying the crackle of fire out into the endless dark. Above them, the stars began to pierce the twilight one by one, and far off, where the earth split open into shadow, the canyon waited, patient, silent, ready for what was coming. The canyon was a scar cut deep into the Texas plains, its walls rising jagged and red against the dying light, the air thick with the scent of dust and iron. Eli Harper rode slow at the edge of the cliffs, the mare's hoofs clinking softly on stone, his every breath a reminder of the wound that still burned deep in his side. Below, a thin trail wound down into the shadows where smoke curled from a small campfire, three shapes moving around it, careless, laughing, unaware of the ghost riding toward them. The wind shifted, carrying voices up the canyon's throat, and Eli's jaw tightened at the sound. McCrae, he'd know that laugh anywhere, loud, cruel, the kind that carried arrogance like a badge of its own. "You stay up here," Eli told Clara, his voice low, steady as carved rock. "No matter what you hear, you don't come down." She didn't argue, didn't plead. She just looked at him, her eyes dark and knowing. "You'll come back?" she said. He didn't answer. Some promises couldn't be made, not on a place like this. He took the revolver from its holster, checked the chamber, 3 bullets left, and started down the trail, his shadow long and thin behind him, a specter descending into the pit where his past waited. The men didn't see him at first. He walked slow, deliberate, boots crunching over gravel, the sound echoing like a heartbeat against the stone walls. When they finally looked up, the laughter died mid-breath. McCrae stood first, his hand drifting to the gun at his hip. "Well, I'll be damned," he drawled, the corner of his mouth curling into that same smirk Eli had seen just before the bullet hit his back. "Didn't figure you'd crawl far after we left your. Guess I underestimated your stubbornness." Eli stopped a few paces away, the dying sun catching the dull gleam of the badge pinned to his chest. "You left me to die," he said, his voice low, quiet as a prayer but heavy as judgment. McCrae chuckled, shrugging. "You were in the way. Simple as that. Silver don't split even, not with too many hands reaching for it." The third man shifted nervously, eyes flicking between them. Eli's gaze hardened. "You sold out your oath. You sold me for a handful of shine that won't buy you peace." McCrae's grin faded. "Don't talk to me about peace, Marshal. Ain't none of us ever had that. You think that star on your chest makes you clean? You killed men same as I did. Only difference is, they pinned it pretty bad on you first." The words hit hard because they weren't lies, not entirely. Eli felt them settle deep in his chest, but he didn't let them show. "Maybe I did," he said quietly, "but I never betrayed my own." The wind picked up, carrying a low hum through the canyon, stirring the ash from the fire, lifting the dust around their boots. For a moment, no one moved. 3 men, 1 ghost, and a reckoning long overdue. Then, the wind shifted. The silence cracked. A single gunshot split the air, sharp and deafening, echoing off the canyon walls. The world seemed to hold its breath. McCrae staggered first, eyes wide, the smugness gone, a dark bloom spreading across his chest. The other 2 drew, too late. Eli's arm moved like instinct. 1 shot, then another, each one finding its mark. When the echo died, all that remained was the ragged sound of his breathing and the faint rattle of empty shells hitting the ground. He stood still for a long time, the gun hanging loose in his hand, smoke curling upward from the barrel. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and blood, mingling with the dust. One by one, the bodies stilled, and silence returned to the canyon. Eli holstered the revolver, his hands shaking now that it was over, though he wasn't sure if it was from pain or relief. He looked down at McCrae's lifeless form and whispered, almost gently, "You were right about one thing. Ain't no peace for men like us." When he climbed back up the trail, his steps were slow, uneven. Clara was waiting where he'd left her, the horse at her side, her face pale but calm. Her eyes searched him, and when she saw the blood on his sleeve, the exhaustion in his eyes, she didn't flinch. She just said, "It's done, ain't it?" He nodded. She looked past him toward the canyon, then back at him. "You look sad," she said softly. He met her gaze, and for once, didn't hide what he felt. "Sometimes justice costs blood," he said, "even when it's your own." The wind rose again, sweeping across the plains, carrying away the last traces of smoke and the ghosts that lingered below. And together, under a sky painted with the dying light, they turned their horse toward the horizon, leaving behind the canyon and everything buried in it. The first light of dawn broke like a soft mercy over the Texas plains, stretching long fingers of gold through the thinning mist. The canyon lay behind them, silent now, its echoes swallowed by time, the dust still bearing faint traces of the violence that had been done. Eli Harper rode slow, his body swaying in the saddle, one hand gripping the reins, the other pressed against his side where blood had long since soaked through the fabric of his shirt. Each breath came shallower than the last, the pain burning like fire under his ribs, but he said nothing. The horizon ahead shimmered, endless, beautiful, empty. Beside him, Clara rose in silence, her small figure straight-backed, her eyes fixed on the light ahead as though she could will them both toward it. Neither spoke. Words felt too fragile after the night they'd lived through, after the reckoning that had left 3 men dead and 1 broken marshal trying to pretend he was still made of iron. The air was cool, the wind carrying the faint smell of rain, but Eli's skin burned as though he still stood beneath the noon sun. He felt the world tilting under him, the edges of his vision going dark, his fingers loosening on the reins. The horse slowed, sensing its rider's weakness. Clara turned just as he slipped sideways, her voice catching in her throat. Eli. He hit the ground hard, the sound of it lost beneath the whispering wind. Clara jumped down, landing barefoot in the dust, and ran to him. He was still breathing, but barely. His eyes flickered open, the blue of them pale and distant, like water at the bottom of a well. "Guess I ain't as tough as I thought," he rasped, a weak attempted humor that turned into a cough, dark blood staining his lips. Clara shook her head fiercely, tears stinging her sun-cracked cheeks. "Don't talk like that," she said, her small hands pressing against his wound as if she could hold him together by sheer will. He caught one of her wrists, his touch gentle despite the tremor in his fingers. "You did good, Clara. You kept me alive longer than I deserved." She didn't understand what he meant, but the way he said it made her chest ache. He looked so tired, tired in a way that went deeper than the body, reaching into the soul. His gaze drifted toward the rising sun, its light spilling across the plains like forgiveness. "You see that?" he murmured. "Never thought I'd get to see another morning." Clara swallowed hard and reached into her satchel, her hand brushing against something cold and heavy. The badge. She pulled it out, the metal dulled with blood and dust, and held it over his chest. "You can stop now," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't gotta fight no more." She pressed the badge gently against his heart, her small hand trembling. The gesture, simple as it was, carried more grace than any prayer. Eli looked down at her, his breath shallow but steady, and for a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, a smile formed on his face, a faint, peaceful thing, more memory than expression. "You keep that fire, girl," he said, each word softer than the last. "The world's gonna need it." His eyes fluttered shut, the lines of pain easing from his face. For the first time in years, he looked at peace, not a lawman, not a ghost of vengeance, just a man who had finally laid down his burdens beneath an open sky. Clara stayed there beside him, the dawn stretching wide around them. The wind brushed her hair across her face, carrying with it the faint hum of the plains waking to another day. She could hear the distant call of birds, the whisper of grass moving underfoot, and it felt like the land itself was exhaling, washing clean the blood and the sorrow that had stained the night before. She took the badge in both hands and held it against her heart, her fingers tracing the star's edges as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "Goodbye, Eli," she said, her voice steady now, strong in its sadness. The sun rose higher, gilding the world in gold, and in that light, everything seemed softer, the dust, the wind, even the silence. When she finally stood, her shadow stretched long beside his, reaching eastward, toward whatever lay ahead. She turned her face toward the horizon and began to walk, the badge hanging from a cord around her neck, the dawn's warmth on her back. Behind her, the wind moved through the grass like a whisper, carrying with it the memory of a man who had once been broken, and the girl who taught him what mercy looked like. The wind came first, long before the riders, sweeping across the open plains like a living thing, carrying dust, the scent of rain, and something older still, something that whispered through the grass and over the rocks as though the land itself remembered what had happened there. When the riders crested the ridge, the sun was just breaking through the clouds, painting the world in bands of gold and rose. They reined in their horses, staring down at the sight below. The canyon lay quiet, its silence broken only by the rustle of wind. 3 bodies lay sprawled near the dead campfire, their guns scattered, their boots half buried in dust. The men who'd once terrorized the county were gone, swallowed by their own sins. But it wasn't the corpses that held the riders' eyes, it was the small figure moving steadily along the ridge beyond them. A little girl, no older than 9, barefoot and dust-streaked, her dress torn and her hair tangled by wind, leading a horse with a wounded man slumped in the saddle. The mare walked slow, her head bowed, her sides slick with sweat, but she kept on, guided by the small, determined hand that held her reins. The man she carried looked like death and defiance bound together, his shirt dark with blood, his face gray, his hat pulled low to shade eyes that still burned with the remnants of a storm. And at his chest, faintly glinting against the morning light, was a badge. The riders watched in silence as the pair moved past, neither of them speaking, neither looking back. They might have been ghosts, for how quiet they were, how unreal they seemed against the endless sweep of the land. One of the riders, a grizzled old ranch hand named Boone, took off his hat and muttered, "That's Marshal Harper, or what's left of him." The others looked at one another, uneasy. Everyone had heard the rumors, the ambush in the canyon, the silver, the betrayal, but none had believed the lawman could have survived it. And yet here he was, carried not by vengeance now, but by the will of a child who refused to let him die. "Who's the girl?" another man asked, his voice low. Boone just shook his head. "Don't know, but looks to me like she's got more grit than most men I've ever met." They watched a little longer, until the two figures disappeared into the light, swallowed by the horizon. And though the riders would later search the canyon, bury the dead, and piece together what little they could, none of them ever saw the pair again. But stories have a way of surviving where people don't. Within days, the tale spread, across towns and saloons, down rivers and through the wind. Some said the marshal had been left for dead by his own men and brought back by an angel with bare feet and a voice that could calm the dying. Others swore she was no angel but the spirit of the plains itself, sent to test whether there was still goodness left in the hearts of men. Folks told of how she nursed him, fought the desert, and led him through death's country until he could stand again. Some claimed she'd carried him herself when the horse fell, walking for miles through dust and wind, her small hands never letting go. The details changed with each retelling. Some made him die in her arms beneath the sunrise. Others said they rode west together, chasing the horizon until both vanished. But no matter the telling, the heart of it stayed the same. A lawman betrayed, a child who saved him, and the proof that even in the harshest land under heaven, mercy still found a way to bloom. Years later, travelers passing through that stretch of the Texas plains swore they could hear things when the wind turned east at dusk, the faint jingle of spurs, the soft murmur of a man's voice carried on the air, and, sometimes, the laughter of a little girl. They said the sound came from nowhere and everywhere at once, rising with the wind and fading with it. And those who stopped long enough to listen, those who let the silence take hold, swore they could almost see them. A marshal riding Paul once more, the badge gleaming bright on his chest, and beside him, a child with wild hair and eyes that held the whole horizon. Together, they rode toward the dawn that never ended, leaving behind only the whisper of their legend, carried forever by the breath of the Texas wind. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.